It began with dust, heat, the clatter of engines echoing across the barren North African desert. The year was 1943, and a German logistics officer was staring at a sight that didn't make sense. Row after row of captured American motorcycles baked under the Tunisian sun, their olive-drab paint turning to chalk, their chrome dulled by sand. At first glance, they looked crude compared to the precision of German engineering. But the officer wasn't looking at craftsmanship. He was counting. 73 of them, all nearly identical. 73 machines, fresh from the factory floor, hundreds of kilometers from any American city, shipped across oceans, unloaded onto beaches, assembled and deployed, all to this desolate stretch of Africa. He realized something profound. If America could leave 73 of these here, how many more could they build? That single moment, an officer squinting through desert heat, captured the industrial imbalance of World War II better than any statistic. The motorcycle was the Harley-Davidson WLA, a two-wheeled workhorse born not from luxury or speed, but from necessity, designed to be mass-produced, easily repaired, and dependable in the worst conditions imaginable. Before the war, Harley-Davidson was already an American icon. Founded in 1903 in a small shed in Milwaukee, the company had built its reputation on endurance and reliability. By the time the Great Depression hit, Harley had survived economic collapse by supplying police and military forces around the world. But when war came again in 1939, Harley faced a different challenge: not to sell motorcycles, but to help win a global conflict. The United States Army needed a vehicle small enough to navigate rough terrain, cheap enough to build by the thousands, and tough enough to keep running on poor fuel and no sleep. Harley's engineers answered with a stripped-down version of their civilian WL model. The A in WLA stood for Army. It kept the same 45 cubic inch side-valve V-twin engine, but lost all unnecessary luxury. No chrome, no polish. Just olive paint and function. What made the WLA extraordinary wasn't what it had, but what it didn't. It didn't need high-octane fuel. It didn't need complex tools. It didn't even need a mechanic with specialized training. A soldier with a wrench and a manual could tear it down and rebuild it on the side of a muddy road. Across the ocean, Germany fielded the BMW R75 and Zundap KS 750, machines that were mechanical marvels. Precision engineered with complex gearboxes and sidecars capable of engaging both wheels in four-wheel drive. They were beautiful, efficient, and expensive. Too expensive. While Germany built perfection, America built quantity. In 1942, Harley-Davidson's Milwaukee plant stopped almost all civilian production. The company turned its assembly lines entirely to the war effort. Factories expanded, women filled the workforce, and parts suppliers retooled overnight. By the end of the war, Harley had produced nearly 90,000 WLA motorcycles, more than any other combat motorcycle in history. It wasn't just a machine, it was a logistics miracle. Each WLA was shipped with crates of standardized spare parts, wiring, tires, bolts that could fit any model. An entire global supply chain revolved around ensuring that no matter where a WLA was deployed, from the frozen forests of Finland to the steaming jungles of Burma, its parts would fit. When the United States joined the war in 1941, Harley-Davidson became part of something far larger: the arsenal of democracy. The phrase wasn't just rhetoric. Between 1940 and 1945, American factories produced more than 300,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, and millions of trucks, rifles, and radios. Every minute of every day, something new rolled off an assembly line. The WLA was the smallest cog in that massive machine, but it carried the same spirit. Each motorcycle was hand-inspected, test-ridden, then coated in cosmoline, a greasy protective film, to survive months at sea. From Milwaukee, they traveled by rail to the East Coast, loaded into Liberty ships and scattered across the world. The Germans never fully understood how such scale was possible. Their factories were designed for precision, not redundancy. When an Allied bombing raid destroyed a BMW plant, production halted for months. In America, if one factory fell behind, another picked up the slack. The system, not the machine, was the secret weapon. By 1943, the North African campaign had become a proving ground for every kind of military vehicle. The Americans rolled ashore with columns of trucks, jeeps, and motorcycles, the mechanical embodiment of an industrial nation at full tilt. The desert was brutal, dust infiltrated everything, engines choked on sand, bearings wore down, carburetors clogged. Yet the Harley kept going. Its air filter could be cleaned with nothing but a rag. Its chain could be adjusted without special tools. Its valves could be serviced in the field. German troops began to notice. At first, they mocked the primitive American bikes, heavy, slow, unrefined. But soon they realized these machines didn't break, and if they did, they could be repaired in minutes. The BMW R75 required skilled mechanics and rare spare parts. The Harley WLA required willpower and a socket set. That difference between complexity and practicality was mirrored across the entire war effort. When American troops advanced, they brought their supply lines with them. Shipments of spare parts followed every division. Entire motor pools moved like living organisms, with soldiers who could fix their own transport in hours instead of waiting for replacements. The Germans, by contrast, fought a war of attrition with machines that could not be easily replaced. The story of the German sergeant in Tunisia is small but telling. Faced with 73 captured Harleys, he realized the true weight of American production. Each of those bikes represented a factory shift. A worker in Milwaukee tightening a bolt, a ship crossing the Atlantic, and a soldier arriving with a machine that worked. The math was unthinkable. If the Americans could leave 73 behind, how many more were coming? It wasn't just motorcycles, it was an industrial tide. That moment, standing amid the rows of identical olive-drab Harleys, was a glimpse into a future Germany could not hope to match. By 1943, the United States was producing more war material than all the Axis powers combined. American factories ran day and night, their lights glowing across the Midwest like small suns. Women welded frames, teenagers packed crates, and trains thundered eastward loaded with steel, oil, and motion. Every nut and bolt carried a single unspoken message. This war would not be won by brilliance, it would be won by momentum. While the German army fought to hold North Africa, America was already preparing for the next front. The invasion of Italy, the liberation of France, the WLA would be there for all of it. In Italy, dispatch riders carried messages through mountains and rubble, their engines echoing between bombed-out villages. In Normandy, they splashed through mud, guiding convoys off the beaches. In France, they escorted generals, carried maps, patrolled liberated cities. To the men who rode them, these motorcycles were more than tools, they were companions. Soldiers gave them nicknames, painted pin-ups on their fuel tanks, and joked that a Harley could survive a war better than a man could. And often they were right. In the European winter of 1944, temperatures dropped below freezing. Gasoline thickened, engines refused to start. The Harley's side valve engine, low compression and forgiving, still turned over. Riders wrapped the engines in blankets at night, lit fires under the oil pans, and kept moving. Meanwhile, across the Eastern Front, Soviet soldiers rode their own version of the WLA, the M72, built under license and adapted from captured BMW designs, but supplied with American parts through the Lend-Lease program. More than 30,000 WLAS were shipped to the Soviet Union. They crossed frozen seas in Arctic convoys, survived U-boat attacks, and arrived in Murmansk coated in ice. From there, they spread across the steppe, serving as couriers and scouts in battles from Kursk to Berlin. When the war finally ended, the WLA had traveled farther than any other motorcycle in history. It had ridden through snow, sand, jungle, and mud. It had carried generals and privates, mail and ammunition, orders and hope. And when peace came, it didn't stop. After 1945, thousands of surplus WLAS flooded the civilian market. Soldiers returning home bought them cheap from government auctions. They stripped off the military gear, repainted them, customized them. Without knowing it, they created something new, the American biker culture. The chopper, the bobber, the open road, all of it began with the WLA. The same machine that had crossed Africa and Europe now crossed America in peacetime, roaring down highways instead of battlefields. But before it became a symbol of freedom, it had been a symbol of something even greater: industrial democracy. In the end, the Harley-Davidson WLA wasn't the best motorcycle of the war. It wasn't the fastest or the most advanced, but it was the right motorcycle, the one that could be built by the tens of thousands, shipped across the world, and still run in the hands of a farm boy turned soldier. It was proof that simplicity, reliability, and sheer numbers could triumph over perfection. When that German officer counted 73 motorcycles in the Tunisian sun, he wasn't counting machines. He was counting destiny. Because behind every Harley was a factory still running, a worker still building, a nation still moving. And against that, no army on earth could stand. By 1943, the war had become a contest not only of armies, but of assembly lines. While German factories operated under constant bombardment, American production reached a scale the world had never seen. The United States was turning raw ore into tanks, planes, and motorcycles faster than anyone thought possible. The Harley-Davidson WLA was a small part of that vast engine, yet it symbolized everything the Allies had learned about the new art of industrial warfare. Every component of the WLA was designed with purpose. The 45 cubic inch flathead engine could tolerate dirt, poor fuel, and neglect. The foot clutch and hand shifter were crude but durable. The Springer front suspension, a design already decades old, was chosen not for comfort but for its ability to be rebuilt in minutes. Even the tires were standardized to match those used on other US vehicles, simplifying logistics. In a typical American depot, crates of WLAS were stacked in neat rows, each one identical, each one ready to run. Mechanics could open a box, attach handlebars and wheels, pour in gasoline, and start it within an hour. It was a machine designed for scale, built by the thousands for a war that demanded millions. The Germans could never match it. Their BMW R75 was technically superior in every measurable way. Dual-driven axles, complex gear ratios, even a reverse gear. But with that complexity came fragility. It required skilled mechanics and parts made to microscopic tolerances. When one broke, it stayed broken until the correct piece could be machined. The Harley could be hammered back into shape with a rock and still run. The difference became a metaphor for the war itself. Germany had entered the conflict with discipline, precision, and a belief in engineering as destiny. America answered with scale, flexibility, and a belief that if one machine failed, 10 more would take its place. In the desert campaigns of 1942 and 1943, this philosophy proved decisive. The supply chain became as important as any tank or aircraft. Allied mechanics rebuilt engines under canvas tents, while convoys of trucks and motorcycles carried fuel and orders through endless sand. When a Harley broke down, a soldier could scavenge parts from another and be moving again within the hour. When a BMW failed, it was often abandoned. The WLA became a common sight in every theater. In North Africa, its tires chewed through dust. In Italy, it climbed broken mountain roads. In France, it weaved between jeeps and tanks in convoys that stretched for miles. Photographs show soldiers leaning against them, cigarettes in hand, faces streaked with grime. They were not glamorous, but they were indispensable. Back in Milwaukee, the Harley-Davidson plant roared day and night. Nearly 30% of the company's workforce were women, many of whom had never worked in a factory before. They learned to weld, rivet, and assemble engines with precision and pride. Posters on the walls reminded them that every motorcycle built might save a life. When the war ended, those women would return to their families, but their contribution would remain written in steel. The WLA also connected armies in unexpected ways. Through the Lend-Lease program, thousands were shipped to allies across the world. The Soviet Union received shipments via the treacherous Arctic convoys, each crate coated in grease to survive the salt and cold. In the hands of Soviet dispatch riders, the WLA carried orders across frozen forests and burning cities alike. British forces received their own shipments, sometimes modifying them with blackout lights or British carburetors. Even Canadian and Australian troops relied on the Harley, calling it the Liberator. The name was fitting. It liberated communication, liberated mobility, and in a way, liberated warfare from the constraints of terrain. While tanks smashed through front lines, it was often a WLA that brought the message forward, carrying a slip of paper or a radio operator through chaos. By the middle of 1944, Harley-Davidson had produced over 70,000 of them. Each one carried a story. Some were destroyed in battle, others abandoned in the mud. Many survived, patched together again and again, the paint worn away to reveal the bare metal beneath. They outlasted campaigns, commanders, even empires. For soldiers, the Harley became a constant companion. Riders named their bikes, scratched initials into the gas tanks, tied good luck charms to the handlebars. When they were forced to leave them behind, many looked back with something like grief. Yet even then, the WLA's legacy was just beginning. After the fall of Tunisia, the Allies pushed north into Italy, and the motorcycles went with them. Through Sicily, Naples, Rome, every new landing brought columns of machines. They escorted generals, directed convoys, scouted routes, and carried mail to soldiers who hadn't heard from home in months. And then came France. On June 6, 1944, as Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, WLAS rolled off landing craft alongside jeeps and half-tracks. Within days, dispatch riders were roaring down narrow hedgerow roads, their engines echoing through the countryside. In photographs from the liberation of Paris, you can see them in the background, olive-drab silhouettes, weaving through crowds, flags flying from their fenders. The WLA was never meant to be heroic, but it became a symbol of presence. Wherever it appeared, the Allies were advancing. Its simplicity was its armor, its endurance was its weapon. Even in defeat, the Germans recognized it. Their reports from Tunisia and later from France noted that American motorcycles arrive in great number, identical, with endless supplies of spare parts. It was as if they were multiplying. In truth, they were. For every Harley lost in combat, another waited in a crate, ready to be unboxed and ridden into the next battle. The United States had not just built an army, it had built an assembly line that reached from the heartland to every front on Earth. By 1945, that system had crushed its enemies under sheer production. The Harley-Davidson WLA became more than a machine. It became a messenger of industry, proof that modern war would be won not only by courage, but by coordination. After victory in Europe, many of the motorcycles were left behind. Some went to civilian police forces, others were traded to Allied governments or sold as surplus. In the Soviet Union, engineers studied the Harley's design, admiring its robustness. They saw in it something they could use, a template for a new generation of Soviet motorcycles. They built their own version, the M72. It was nearly identical to the Harley in philosophy, if not in form, simple, rugged, easy to maintain. It would serve for decades, from Berlin to Korea. The WLA had done more than fight a war. It had spread a doctrine. When the guns finally fell silent, Harley-Davidson returned to civilian production. But the world had changed. The same factories that once built war machines now faced peacetime demand. Workers were laid off, and the company struggled to adjust. Yet its image had been transformed. To millions of returning soldiers, Harley-Davidson wasn't just a motorcycle company, it was part of their story. Those veterans began buying the same bikes they'd ridden overseas, stripping them of military hardware, repainting them in bright colors. The war-born Harley became the peacetime Harley, the foundation of a culture built on the idea of freedom, speed, and the open road. In Europe, the remnants of WLAS found new life too. In Poland, France, and the Netherlands, civilians rebuilt them from parts left behind by armies. Farmers used them to carry supplies, mechanics turned them into racers, and young men rode them through cities still scarred by war. A machine built to fight became a machine to live again. What began in Milwaukee as an industrial answer to a military need had become a global phenomenon. And behind it all remained the quiet truth discovered in that Tunisian depot years before. America's strength had never been in perfection. It had been in production. Every bolt, every weld, every cast piece of metal in the WLA told a story of mass production refined into an art form. The United States had embraced the machine age like no other nation on Earth. From the smallest screw to the largest bomber, Every item rolling off its assembly lines spoke the same language: efficiency, standardization, reliability. And in that language, the Harley-Davidson WLA was poetry written in iron. Its serial numbers told a tale of unstoppable momentum. By the end of 1943, tens of thousands had already been built, each marked with the 42 prefix from its original design year. They came from the same blueprints, the same measurements, the same patterns of steel stamping and machining. This was not about individuality or craftsmanship, it was about replication. The Americans had perfected the process of building not one great machine, but a million good ones. That philosophy extended across the entire Allied war effort. The Jeep, the Liberty ship, the Sherman tank, the P-51 Mustang all followed the same logic. Build it strong, build it simple, build it by the thousands. It was a kind of mechanical democracy where every component mattered only because it could be replaced by another just like it. For the men on the front lines, that sameness was a comfort. If you knew how to fix one Harley, you could fix any Harley. A soldier in the Italian mountains could swap a carburetor with a mechanic in the Burmese jungle, and the part would fit. That kind of interchangeability was something Germany, for all its engineering brilliance, never achieved. German design prized precision. American design prized persistence. When you're fighting across half the planet, persistence wins. The WLA had a curious effect on those who rode it. At first, soldiers saw it as just another piece of government equipment. But the longer they used it, the more it felt like an extension of themselves. Dispatch riders often described their bikes as partners, loyal and dependable. They gave them names, painted symbols on the tanks, and shared rations with them as if they were comrades. When a Harley finally broke beyond repair, some soldiers buried it, marking the grave with a spare helmet. It sounds sentimental, but in war, sentiment becomes survival. On the German side, the sight of these motorcycles arriving in endless numbers had its own psychological effect. Reports from field units described the shock of seeing American convoys stretching to the horizon, their vehicles uniform and abundant. A single motor pool could contain more Harleys than an entire German division would see in a year. For men who had grown up in a culture that celebrated precision and scarcity, it was like facing an opponent who could summon machines out of thin air. And in a sense, America could. The United States industrial base was so vast that production could shift from cars to tanks to motorcycles almost overnight. When Harley-Davidson received the Army's contract, the company's engineers didn't need to reinvent the wheel. They simply adapted what already worked. The result wasn't elegant, but it was effective. Even the paint, standard Army olive drab, was chosen for practicality. It was durable, easy to apply, and hid dirt well. Spare parts were packed in identical boxes with printed diagrams, so a soldier who couldn't read could still follow the instructions. Everything about the WLA said the same thing: make it simple, make it everywhere. Back home, factory life mirrored the front lines in its own way. The Milwaukee plant ran around the clock under bright lights and the constant hum of machinery. Families measured time not in days but in shifts: day shift, swing shift, night shift. The workers' cafeteria served coffee strong enough to keep people awake through 12-hour stretches. Supervisors walked the lines with stopwatches, timing each assembly step. It was efficiency raised to the level of ritual. Yet even within that relentless pace, pride endured. Workers signed their initials on hidden parts, a quiet signature beneath the machine's skin. When inspectors stamped the Army's acceptance mark, a small ordnance bomb symbol, it was more than a quality check. It was a badge of contribution. Those badges mattered. In 1943, Harley-Davidson received the Army-Navy E Award for excellence in wartime production. Less than 5% of suppliers earned it. The ceremony was held outside the factory, flags raised, bands playing, officers shaking hands with grease-stained workers. For a few hours, Milwaukee felt like the front line of victory. The WLA was also an economic weapon. Each motorcycle cost the US government about $380 to produce, cheap by military standards. Germany's BMW R75, with its complex sidecar drive and heavy gearbox, cost more than twice as much and required far more skilled labor. The difference multiplied over tens of thousands of units became staggering. Germany's war machine, already strained by shortages, simply couldn't compete. Every time an American assembly line increased output, German engineers were forced to chase quality at the cost of quantity. It was a race they couldn't win. By late 1944, even Hitler's generals understood the numbers. No matter how many tactical victories they achieved, industrial arithmetic would crush them. One German officer captured in Normandy put it bluntly, "They build as if the war will last 100 years." In some ways, that was true. The Americans had built not only for war, but for endurance. The factories that produced WLAS could be retooled for anything: civilian bikes, tractors, even refrigerators. The infrastructure itself was an investment in the future, ensuring that when the war ended, the economy would not. The WLA was a piece of that puzzle, a gear in the machine that turned the 20th century. Even in defeat, it carried forward the philosophy of its making. After 1945, when tens of thousands of surplus WLAS flooded the civilian market, they became the backbone of motorcycle culture. Veterans who had ridden them in North Africa or Europe brought them home, stripped off the fenders, and began to customize. They called them bobbers, cutting weight to chase speed. The culture of the open road, black leather, chrome, roaring engines, was born from those surplus bikes. In Europe, the same motorcycles lived on in a different way. The Soviet Union kept its Lend-Lease WLAS running for decades, repainting them, fitting new tires, and passing them from one generation to the next. Some ended up in parades, others in police units. When Western collectors began searching for original WLAS in the 1980s, many of the best-preserved examples came from Eastern Europe, still wearing Cyrillic maintenance stencils. The fact that so many survived speaks volumes. A machine designed for a few years of war endured for half a century. It is strange to think that one of the most powerful symbols of post-war American freedom began as a tool of total war. But that contradiction is the essence of the WLA's story. Built for destruction, it became a vessel for independence. Forged in mass production, it came to represent individuality. And behind it all, hidden in its engine's steady rhythm, is the faint echo of that February morning in Tunisia, when a German sergeant crouched beside a captured Harley and realized what it meant. The machine before him wasn't just a motorcycle. It was the embodiment of an idea that in an industrial war, victory belongs to the side that can keep building, the side that never runs out. The WLA wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. It just had to be enough, built often enough to keep the wheels of history turning. And when you hear one start today, that deep, uneven rumble, you can almost hear the factories waking up again, the sound of an entire nation in motion. The Harley-Davidson WLA was never the fastest, never the most advanced, never the prettiest. But it was the motorcycle that proved a simple truth. In a war of machines, the side that masters production masters fate. It was the hum of Milwaukee turned into momentum, the pulse of a factory that beat louder than the bombs. And even now, long after the engines have cooled, that pulse still echoes across time, a heartbeat made of steel and faith, steady and unstoppable. When peace finally returned, the Harley-Davidson WLA stood at a crossroads between war and the new world that followed. The machines that had once roared across deserts and cities now sat idle in depots and scrap yards, their olive paint faded, their tires flat. But they were far too valuable to be forgotten. Thousands were auctioned off as military surplus, often for less than $100 apiece. Mechanics, farmers, and young men hungry for adventure lined up to buy them. They stripped away the rifle scabbards and blackout lights, polished the tanks, and gave them new paint: bright reds, deep blacks, gleaming chrome. The same motorcycles that had once carried dispatches through shellfire were now roaring down peacetime highways. Reborn as icons of freedom, the sound that once signaled orders and urgency now spoke of escape. The veterans who rode them had known chaos. Now they sought control. With every twist of the throttle, they relived the feeling of breaking through danger and distance. The open road became their new battlefield, and peace, their victory. For Harley-Davidson, the transition from war to peace was not simple. The company's wartime output had kept it alive through the Great Depression, but now demand for civilian motorcycles was uncertain. American consumers wanted cars, not bikes, yet something intangible had changed in the national psyche. The soldiers returning home brought with them memories of machinery that had never failed them. They wanted that reliability again, that same growl beneath their hands. So Harley adapted. The post-war models borrowed heavily from the WLA's engineering, the flathead engine, the rugged frame, the no-nonsense design. But the styling evolved: chrome accents, teardrop fuel tanks, deep fenders. What had once been a tool of war became an object of aspiration. And for many, it was more than transportation. It was therapy. The war had left scars that could not be seen. Restlessness, adrenaline that never faded, memories that surfaced with every sudden sound. On a motorcycle, the world narrowed to the road and the wind. It was focus, freedom, and forgetfulness all at once. Clubs began to form, groups of veterans who met not in uniform, but in leather jackets. They rode for the feeling of movement, the camaraderie they'd lost when the fighting ended. Some were orderly, others wild. The media called them rebels, outlaws. But underneath the noise and spectacle was something simple: men trying to hold on to the one part of the war that had given them peace: the ride. The Harley WLA, now modified and reborn, was at the center of it all. Across the Atlantic, similar transformations were happening. In Europe, the WLAS left behind became a kind of currency. French mechanics scavenged parts from military dumps, turning them into civilian bikes. In the Netherlands, farmers used them to pull carts. In Eastern Europe, the Soviets and their allies continued to ride their Lend-Lease Harleys long after newer machines replaced them elsewhere. Even decades later, in dusty barns and forgotten garages, these motorcycles waited. Their olive paint still carried the smell of oil and age, their serial numbers faint but legible. Each one was a time capsule, a machine that had crossed continents, outlived empires, and survived not just one war, but history itself. Collectors would one day call them treasures, restoring them to running condition, seeking authenticity in every bolt and scratch. But in their day, they were simply survivors. It's easy now to romanticize them, to see the WLA as a symbol of freedom and courage. But for the men who built and rode them, they were tools, nothing more. The romance came later, in memory, in reflection, in stories told by those who lived long enough to remember what the machine meant. Because the WLA wasn't just an American story, it was global. It linked Milwaukee to Moscow, Detroit to Dunkirk, Wisconsin to Warsaw. In its steel bones were the fingerprints of workers from every corner of the Allied world. The oil it ran on came from refineries in Texas, the rubber in its tires from plantations in Ceylon, the metal in its frame from the mines of Minnesota. When it moved, it carried the weight of a world at war and the hope of a world trying to rebuild. That hope took many forms. In post-war Europe, Harley-Davidson sent technicians to help rebuild shattered infrastructure. Some of the same factories that once built war machines now produced parts for reconstruction. Motorcycles delivered mail again, instead of orders, medicine instead of munitions. The WLA had become a paradox, a machine born for war that made peace move faster. Its legend only grew with time. The US Army officially retired its WLAS in the 1950s, replacing them with newer models, but many continued to serve in reserve units and police departments for years after. Some even found their way into the Korean War, carrying messages through terrain not unlike the hills of Italy. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, the M72 and its descendants, based on both Harley and BMW designs, rolled off assembly lines for decades. They became the backbone of Eastern Bloc transport, seen in parades and propaganda films alike. Without knowing it, those riders were continuing the legacy of a machine built in an American factory a world away. The WLA's influence even reached design philosophies in Japan, where post-war engineers studied captured Allied vehicles to learn modern manufacturing techniques. Decades later, the precision and efficiency that defined Japanese industry could trace part of its lineage back to the wartime innovations of mass production, perfected in places like Milwaukee. In that way, the WLA's story is not just about motorcycles. It's about how ideas spread, how technology born from necessity becomes culture, and how culture reshapes the world. Today, when you see a Harley-Davidson thundering down an open road, you're hearing echoes of that past. The deep, uneven pulse of the V-twin engine still carries the same rhythm as those wartime machines. It's a rhythm that speaks of endurance, simplicity, and the strange beauty of persistence. The men who once rode them are mostly gone now. Their voices live on in diaries, in photographs, in fading film reels. But their machines, many of them still running, are the closest thing we have to their heartbeat. Somewhere, in a museum or a dusty shed, a WLA waits. Its metal is pitted, its tires cracked, but its purpose is unchanged. Turn the key, prime the carburetor, kick the starter, and it will answer, just as it did 80 years ago. The sound will rise slowly, uncertain at first, then steady, filling the air with that unmistakable growl. And in that sound, history breathes again. Because the WLA was never just about war. It was about what humanity can build when it must. It was about the power of ordinary people, workers, mechanics, riders, who together created something greater than themselves. The motorcycle may have carried dispatches, but it also carried something far more enduring. Proof that progress is not measured only in victories, but in what survives afterward. When the German sergeant found that Harley in the Tunisian depot, he saw a mystery. He saw a machine that had no weaknesses he could exploit, no inefficiencies he could mock. It was a machine that simply worked. What he didn't realize was that he was looking at the future of industry, of warfare, of how nations would rise and fall not by the brilliance of their inventions, but by their ability to make them last. And the Harley-Davidson WLA lasted. Through mud and fire, through history itself, it endured. And long after the war's final echoes faded, its engine kept running. Steady, patient, unbroken. Like the heartbeat of a world rebuilt from steel and sweat and faith. The war ended. The riders went home. The factories fell silent. But somewhere, even now, a WLA waits, ready to start again. Because machines like that never truly die. They just wait for someone who remembers to bring them back to life.